Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on a case that's before the Supreme Court,
Hmm.
and it could really impact the whole federal government.
Right.
It's the kind of thing that, usually gets really bogged down in legal jargon,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it actually has some pretty big real-world implications for just about everybody.
Oh, absolutely.
So get this.
Okay.
We've got the Trump administration going head-to-head with this, little-known federal agency.
Hmm.
And it's a whole battle over presidential power. And then just to make things even more interesting,
Okay.
Elon Musk is somehow mixed up in all of this.
Yeah, this case is a great example of like a fundamental tension that we have, in our system.
Mm.
You've got the president's authority to kind of shape the executive branch.
Right.
But then on the other side, you've got these independent agencies that are supposed to operate outside of, direct political control.
Yeah.
So this case is really going to put that tension under the microscope.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. Who are the main players here, and what are they actually fighting about?
Okay, so the guy at the center of all this is Hampton Dellinger.
Okay.
He's the head of the U.S. Office of Special Counsel.
Mm.
He was appointed by Biden and confirmed by the Senate back in 2024.
Okay.
But now the Trump administration is trying to get rid of him.
Mm.
And they want to put in their own guy, Doug Collins, who is currently the Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
The Office of Special Counsel. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick rundown of what this agency actually does?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't spent years, studying government org charts,
Right.
the Office of Special Counsel, or OSC, plays a really vital role in protecting federal employees and making sure the government's actually functioning the way it's supposed to.
Hmm.
Their main focus is on protecting whistleblowers.
Okay.
Those are the people who, expose wrongdoing within the government.
Right.
The OSC investigates those allegations of retaliation against whistleblowers, and then they try to hold the agencies accountable for, any violations.
So kind of like an internal affairs division for federal employees.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
They investigate misconduct,
Uh-huh.
and they make sure everything's running ethically.
Yeah.
That's a big responsibility.
No, it is.
It is.
And it's important to remember that they're different from those special counsels that we sometimes hear about with criminal investigations.
Okay.
The OSC handles a whole other set of issues, Hatch Act violations, which are those prohibited political activities by federal employees, and then also things like claims of discrimination or, wrongful termination.
Got it. So this isn't just a boring bureaucratic squabble.
Right.
We're talking about an agency that's literally supposed to be a watchdog
Yes.
against corruption and abuse of power within the government.
Exactly.
No wonder this case is causing such a stir.
Yeah, and that's exactly where the conflict with the Trump administration comes in.
Yeah.
Trump has this whole history of wanting to exert more control over the executive branch, and he often views those independent agencies with a lot of skepticism.
Right.
So this whole thing with Dellinger,
Yeah.
it fits into this larger pattern of the administration trying to reshape the entire federal government according to their own vision,
So Biden appoints Dellinger.
Uh-huh.
Then Trump takes office,
Right.
wants him out.
Yeah.
What are the legal grounds for this whole power struggle?
Right.
Can a president just get rid of the head of an independent agency just because they want to?
Well, that's a good question, and that's really the heart of the legal battle here.
Okay.
The law that governs the OSC,
Hmm.
it states that the president can only remove the head of the agency for very specific reasons, like inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. It's designed to create a degree of independence, you know, and protect the OSC from undue political influence.
So there's a legal framework in place.
Yes.
But the Trump administration is challenging it.
They are.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think, because the Supreme Court has weighed in on similar cases
Yes.
involving presidential power in the past.
You're right. There is some precedent here that might actually help the Trump administration's argument.
Yeah.
In recent years, the Supreme Court has actually sided with broader presidential authority over those independent agencies. There were a couple of cases involving the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau
Okay.
and the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
Okay.
And in those cases, the court did seem willing to give the president greater control over the executive branch.
So the Trump administration is using those past rulings to support their case.
Exactly.
But I'm sure that Dellinger and his supporters are pushing back hard.
Oh, absolutely. Dellinger is arguing that, the law is very clear. and that the president doesn't have the authority to remove him without a good reason. He's been fighting this removal in the lower courts.
Right.
And he's managed to get those temporary restraining orders that prevent him from being fired while the case is still going on.
So we have a real legal tug-of-war here.
Yes.
On one side, you have the Trump administration saying that they have broader presidential power, and they're pointing to those previous Supreme Court decisions.
Right.
Then on the other side, you have Dellinger.
Yeah.
And the people that are supporting him. And they're saying, no, the law is very clear about how to remove the head of the OSC.
Right. And that leads us to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
The administration appealed those lower court rulings that blocked Dellinger's removal.
Right.
So now the highest court in the land is being asked to decide this huge question.
Wow.
Presidential authority versus agency independence.
The stakes seem really high.
Oh, they are.
If the Supreme Court sides with Trump,
Yeah.
what kind of message does that send about the power of the president versus the role of independent agencies in our system?
Well, it would be a huge shift in the balance of power if the court were to side with the administration.
Yeah.
It would basically say that presidents have a lot of leeway in removing the heads of agencies, even those that are designed to operate independently. This could have a chilling effect on the work of those agencies.
Okay.
Making them less likely to pursue investigations
Right.
or to challenge powerful interests for fear of, some kind of retaliation.
So basically, it could weaken the whole watchdog function
Exactly.
that those agencies are supposed to do. What about the impact on whistleblowers themselves? If the head of the OSC can just be removed by a president who doesn't like their work,
Right.
wouldn't that make potential whistleblowers think twice
Oh, for sure.
before they come forward?
That's a really valid concern.
Yeah.
Whistleblowers already face a lot of risks when they speak out,
Of course.
and the OSC is supposed to protect them. But if people start to think that the OSC itself is vulnerable to political pressure, it could stop people from coming forward with information about wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And that could have serious consequences for accountability and transparency within the government.
That's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah.
So we have this legal battle going on. And then to make things even more complicated,
Right.
you mentioned that Elon Musk is somehow involved in this.
Yes.
Now, I'm really curious, how does a tech billionaire get involved in a Supreme Court case about presidential power and federal agencies?
It's definitely an unusual twist. We don't know all the details yet, but reports suggest that he's been advising the Trump administration
Oh, wow.
on a bunch of different policy matters,
Okay.
including things like, government reform and deregulation. It seems like his views align with the administration's desire to really shake things up in Washington and to streamline government operations.
I have to push back a little bit here.
Yeah.
I understand that Elon Musk is, a brilliant entrepreneur
Right.
and innovator. But what expertise does he really have when it comes to, the inner workings of government agencies and legal precedent?
Yeah.
Seems like a strange fit to me.
I get your skepticism.
Okay.
Musk's background is definitely in technology and business, not law or government.
Right.
But the administration seems to value his perspective as like an outsider, someone who can bring fresh ideas to the table. They see him as somebody who can help them identify inefficiencies and cut through all the red tape.
So we have this really interesting mix of players here.
We do.
A president who's pushing the boundaries of executive power. A federal agency that's fighting to protect its independence.
Yes.
And a tech mogul who's advising the administration on reshaping the government.
It's a fascinating situation.
But before we go too far down the rabbit hole of Elon Musk's involvement,
Right.
I think we need to understand how this case actually ended up in the Supreme Court. Let's retrace the steps that led to this moment.
Okay, so it all started with the Trump administration trying to remove Dellinger from his position.
Right, and that triggered a series of legal challenges.
Yes.
Walk us through how those unfolded.
Okay, so after the administration made those moves to get rid of Dellinger, he filed a lawsuit arguing that it was unlawful. A federal judge, Amy Berman Jackson, agreed with Dellinger, and she issued a temporary restraining order to block his removal while the case was being decided.
So round one went to Dellinger.
Yeah, you could say that.
But I'm assuming the administration didn't just give up at that point.
No, not at all.
Okay.
They appealed Judge Jackson's ruling to a higher court.
Okay.
But the appeals court upheld the lower court's decision,
Wow.
which really strengthened Dellinger's position.
Okay, so 2 courts now have sided with Dellinger.
Right.
They're reaffirming those legal protections for the head of the OSC. At this point, the administration is facing some pretty big roadblocks.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So what do they do?
Well, faced with these setbacks, in the lower courts, the administration decided to take the case to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
They're basically asking the Supreme Court to overturn the lower court rulings and say that the president does have the authority to remove Dellinger.
Okay, so this legal battle has climbed all the way up the judicial ladder.
It has.
And now the Supreme Court is in charge.
Yes.
And they're about to make a decision that could have a lasting impact on the balance of power in Washington.
Absolutely.
And I'm guessing they've already heard arguments from both sides?
You're right. Both sides have presented their cases to the Supreme Court, laying out their legal arguments and interpretations of the relevant laws and precedents. The acting Solicitor General, Sarah Harris, argued for the administration. And then, of course, Dellinger's legal team presented his defense.
This is like one of those courtroom dramas where everyone's on the edge of their seats waiting for the verdict.
Yeah.
What were the key arguments from each side? What were the main points of contention?
One of the really interesting parts of the arguments before the Supreme Court was this clash over the use of temporary restraining orders. Harris, who represented the administration, argued that the courts shouldn't be able to govern through these temporary orders. She said it undermines the president's ability to actually execute the laws and manage the executive branch.
So they're basically saying that these temporary orders tie the president's hands.
Exactly.
And create a situation where the courts are basically telling the executive branch what to do.
Right. They argued that allowing the lower courts to just issue these orders over and over again creates a dangerous precedent that could really get in the way of the president doing their job.
It sounds like they're saying that the courts are overreaching and interfering with the president's authority.
Yeah, basically.
I'm sure Dellinger's team had a response to that.
They did.
After all those temporary orders were put in place for a reason.
Right. Dellinger's lawyers argued that those temporary restraining orders are an essential tool for courts to prevent, irreparable harm while a case is still going on. In this situation, they argued that allowing Dellinger to be removed before the courts had a chance to fully consider everything would really undermine the independence of the OSC. And it could even put whistleblowers at risk of retaliation.
So it's a classic clash of legal principles.
Yes.
You have the president's need to have authority over the executive branch versus the need for those checks and balances to prevent abuse of power and to protect the integrity of those independent agencies.
Exactly. And now the Supreme Court has to weigh those interests and decide where to draw the line.
This is where things get even more complicated because we have to think about the current political climate and some of the statements coming from people in the administration. I'm specifically thinking about Vice President J.D. Vance and the things he said about potentially not complying with court orders. How does that play into all of this?
That's a really good point. The vice president's comments have definitely raised some concerns about, the administration's commitment to the rule of law. The Solicitor General did emphasize, that they intend to comply with court orders. But those earlier statements from high-ranking officials have definitely created some uncertainty.
It makes you wonder what would happen if the Supreme Court rules against the administration. Will they accept the decision? Or will we see more pushback and defiance?
That's a question that a lot of people are asking right now. The administration's response to whatever the Supreme Court decides will be watched very closely. It'll be a real test of their commitment to the principles of judicial review and the separation of powers.
Okay, so we have this high-stakes legal battle. With potential consequences for the balance of power in Washington. The independence of these watchdog agencies and the future of whistleblowing. And we haven't even talked about the specifics of Elon Musk's involvement yet.
Yeah, there's a lot more to unpack here.
It's safe to say this deep dive is just getting started.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about the big picture implications of this Supreme Court case. But I want to kind of zoom in a little bit and talk about something that's been on my mind.
Sure.
We've talked a lot about, the Office of Special Counsel. But I still don't feel like I have a good grasp on what their work actually looks like day to day.
Yeah.
What kinds of cases do they handle? And what are some concrete examples of the impact they have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really important to move beyond just the principles
Right.
and look at how the OS's work actually plays out in the real world.
Yeah.
So they handle a wide range of things,
Okay.
all related to federal employees,
Mm.
allegations of wrongdoing,
Okay.
whistleblower retaliation, Hatch Act violations,
Right.
claims of discrimination.
Oh.
Their investigations can uncover some pretty serious misconduct within agencies and often lead to, significant changes and reforms.
Could you give us some specific examples?
Sure.
I think that would be really helpful.
Okay, so one notable case involved an OSC investigation into the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Okay.
Whistleblowers had exposed these really long wait times
Wow.
for veterans who were trying to get medical care.
Yeah.
And there were even allegations that the VA was trying to cover it up.
Oh, wow.
The OSC investigated, and they confirmed the allegations.
Wow.
And it led to some pretty big changes within the VA,
Okay.
including, the removal of some top officials, and they implemented a bunch of reforms aimed at improving patient care.
So in that case, the OSC's work had a real direct impact on the lives of veterans.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that this isn't just about bureaucratic procedures. These are actions that can have consequences.
Right.
For real people.
Absolutely. Another case involved a whistleblower who exposed safety concerns at a nuclear power plant.
Oh, wow.
The OSC investigated
Yeah.
and found that the plant was basically cutting corners on safety protocols.
Putting workers and the surrounding community at risk.
Exactly.
That's a pretty powerful example of how the OSC can protect not just federal employees,
Right.
but also the public.
They're kind of like watchdogs for the whole country.
Right.
And their work goes beyond just individual cases, too.
Okay.
The OSC also issues regulations and guidance to federal agencies on all sorts of issues.
Okay.
And that helps shape policies and practices across the government.
So they're really playing a key role in making sure the government runs ethically.
They are.
Protecting whistleblowers.
Yes.
And holding people accountable.
It's a big job.
Okay, I'm starting to get a much clearer picture of what they do.
Good.
It's clear that they play a really critical role.
Yes.
And the outcome of this Supreme Court case
Right.
could really affect their ability to do their job.
Absolutely. If the court sides with the administration and says the president can remove the head of the OSC,
Yeah.
it could really weaken the agency's independence
Right.
and make it much more vulnerable to political pressure.
And that could lead to less whistleblowing.
Exactly.
Because people would be afraid to come forward if they thought the OSC was being controlled by politicians.
Exactly. The implications go beyond just the OSC, too.
Okay.
A ruling like that could set a precedent that weakens other watchdog agencies across the government.
Wow.
Which could really reduce accountability and transparency in a lot of areas.
This is where I want to bring Elon Musk back into the conversation.
Okay.
We've talked about his views on government reform and deregulation. Yeah.
Right. But I'm really curious about his specific views on these independent agencies. Does he think they're important, or does he see them as obstacles?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Musk hasn't really said anything directly about his views on these agencies. But if you look at his public statements, he seems pretty skeptical of government bureaucracy.
Okay.
And he really seems to streamline decision-making.
So it's possible that he sees those agencies as part of the problem.
It's possible.
All that red tape that he thinks is holding things back.
Yeah, his background is in tech.
Right.
Where things move really fast. So he might see these traditional government structures as slow and inefficient.
Right. And that would fit with the Trump administration's goals of shrinking the government and cutting back on regulations.
Exactly. They've been very clear about wanting to limit the power of federal agencies. So Musk's involvement suggests that they're looking for ways to do just that.
And weakening those independent agencies, like the OSC, could be one way to do it.
Okay, so we have a president who wants more control, an advisor who might see independent agencies as the enemy, and a Supreme Court case that could shift the balance of power.
Yeah. This could really change the way our government works.
It's a reminder that we can't just assume that these watchdog agencies will always be there.
Mm.
They play a really important role
They do.
in holding people accountable and protecting the public.
Absolutely. This case shows us that the balance of power in our democracy is always changing.
Right.
We can't just sit back and assume that the system will work the way it's supposed to.
Yeah.
We have to be engaged citizens. We need to understand these developments, and we need to make our voices heard.
Well said. I think we've done a good job explaining this case and what's at stake.
I think so.
But there's one thing we haven't really talked about yet.
Okay.
And it's something that I keep thinking about. What happens next?
Right.
Yeah.
The big question. Everyone's waiting for the Supreme Court's decision.
And what are the possible outcomes?
Okay.
Like, what are the different scenarios we could see play out?
Well, there are a few possibilities.
Okay.
The court could rule in favor of the administration and say that the president does have the broad authority to remove the head of the OSC.
Right.
That would be a huge win for Trump.
Yeah.
And it could have a big impact on the independence of other agencies.
And that could mean less accountability and transparency.
Exactly. It could make it easier for people to get away with doing the wrong thing. On the other hand, the court could rule in favor of Dellinger.
Okay.
They could say that those legal protections for the head of the OSC are valid and that agency independence is important.
Oh.
That would be a big loss for the administration.
Right.
But a win for people who believe in checks and balances.
It would send a message that the president can't just fire people who are supposed to be independent just because he doesn't like what they're doing.
Exactly.
Yep.
There's also the possibility of a more nuanced ruling.
Okay.
The court could uphold some parts of the law, but strike down others.
Okay.
That would make things more complicated.
Right.
It could lead to more legal challenges and more uncertainty about the future of the OSC.
So there are a lot of possibilities here.
There are.
And each one could have a different impact.
Right.
As this case moves forward, what are some things we should be looking for?
The most important thing is the court's decision itself.
Okay.
We need to pay attention to how they interpret the law. Will they focus on the specific words?
Right.
Or will they take a broader view and look at the intent behind creating an independent agency?
So how they interpret the law will tell us something about their philosophy.
Yes.
On presidential power and agency independence.
Exactly. We should also look for any dissenting opinions. Okay. Those can be just as important. They can show us the disagreements within the court, and they can sometimes influence future cases.
It's almost like we're trying to predict the future of our government.
Right.
By reading the minds of 9 justices.
In a way, yes.
Wow.
Their decisions are really important.
Yeah.
They shape the law and define how power works in our society.
Beyond just the legal stuff, I think it's important to remember the political context of this case.
Oh, absolutely.
We're living in a really polarized time.
Yes.
And this case has become a big part of the debate about the role of government and how much power the president should have.
The court's decision isn't going to happen in a vacuum.
Right.
It's going to be interpreted through this lens of political polarization. And those reactions could have a big impact on our political discourse and how our government functions.
It makes you think, what does all of this say about the state of our democracy? Are we at a point where the balance of power is shifting?
Yeah.
And could that have lasting consequences?
Yeah, that's a really big question.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone has the answer yet. But this case is definitely a test for our democratic institutions.
Okay.
It's a test of our commitment to the rule of law. And it reflects how divided we are as a society.
While we're waiting for the court's decision, it's important for all of us to talk about these issues.
Yes.
To understand the legal arguments and to think about the potential consequences.
I agree. This isn't just something we can watch from the sidelines.
Right.
We all have a role to play in this.
Okay.
We need to stay informed, share our opinions, and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said. I think this has been a really insightful conversation.
I agree.
I hope our listeners are feeling more informed and more engaged with this really important issue.
Me too. We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
But this conversation is far from over.
Right.
This case is going to keep unfolding, and the implications will be debated for years to come.
It feels like we're at this really crucial point. You know?
Yeah, it is.
This whole case is about so much more than just one person's job.
Right.
It's really about the balance of power in our government and how we hold those in power accountable.
It really is a microcosm. of this much larger debate
Okay.
about the role of government, limits of executive power, the importance of checks and balances.
Yeah.
What we're really talking about here is the idea of a government that's transparent, accountable, and actually responsive to the people.
What happens if those checks and balances start to disappear? What if those independent agencies like the OSC can't really operate freely anymore?
Right.
Without being afraid of political pressure?
It's a scary thought.
It is.
If agencies like the OSC are seen as being controlled by the president, then their ability to investigate wrongdoing, to protect whistleblowers, and to ensure accountability.
That's all going to be weakened. It could create this culture of fear in the government where people are too afraid to speak up because they might face retaliation.
And if people are afraid to speak up, if there's no accountability, what happens then?
Well, then you create an environment where corruption and abuse of power can thrive. People lose faith in the system. They become cynical, apathetic, and they just stop participating in the process.
That's a dangerous path.
It is.
So as we wait for the Supreme Court to make a decision, what are some signs we should be looking for? What will tell us which way the court is leaning?
One key thing is how they interpret the law that governs the OSC. Will they just focus on the specific language, or will they look at the bigger picture, the historical context and the intention behind creating an independent agency? So how they frame their interpretation will tell us something about their overall philosophy.
Exactly.
What about those dissenting opinions?
Oh, those are important too.
Okay.
They can give us a lot of insight into the different perspectives on the court. And sometimes they can even influence future cases.
It's almost like we're trying to read the tea leaves here.
I know, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to figure out what the court is going to do.
We also have to think about the political context of all of this.
Yes, of course.
You're in this really polarized time, and this case has become like a symbol of the bigger debate about the role of government and the limits of presidential power.
The court's decision isn't going to be made in a vacuum. It's going to be interpreted and reacted to within this highly charged political environment. And those reactions could have a big impact on how we talk about politics and even how our government works.
What does this case tell us about the state of our democracy?
That's a really deep question.
It is.
I don't think anyone knows the answer for sure. This case is definitely a challenge for our democratic institutions. It's a test of our commitment to the rule of law, and it shows just how divided we are as a country.
While we wait for the court's decision, it's important for us to have these conversations.
Absolutely.
To really understand what's at stake and to think about the consequences.
We all have a responsibility here to stay informed, to voice our opinions, and to hold our leaders accountable.
I think this deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Me too.
I hope our listeners are feeling more informed and engaged.
I hope so too.
Do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Just the future of our democracy is not set in stone. It's something we all have to work for. And that means staying informed, participating, and holding our leaders accountable.
I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation.
I agree.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
It's been a privilege to explore these issues with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you.